Welcome to the Outer Realm with Michelle DeRoche and Amelia Pisano. Airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday night segment of The Outer Realm. We're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM from the beautiful city of New Orleans. We are fully sponsored by the amazing people over at Folgers Coffee who have been a part of our journey since the very beginning. And it's been quite a while now, a few years, in fact. So thank you, Folgers. We appreciate you so very much, and it just wouldn't be the same without you. Also, very grateful for our intro. So thank you, Justin Snicker, Dr. Snick, the sonic surgeon, for the contribution of your voice, your music, for our outro as well. Of course, we don't get to that too often as we tend to run out of time, but thank you. And it is the season for Justin Snicker, who is an award-winning composer of Halloween, horror, sci-fi, and dark wave electronic music, which can be found on all of your favorite streaming platforms. Check him out, honestly. He's got new stuff coming out. Like I said, 'tis the season. So also big thank you to artist Steve McGinnis, who is the man behind the banners and the logos here at the show. Check him out on Facebook and Instagram. Also specializes in the horror genre, but can do any commission piece you so choose, including books and comics. So check that out. Guys, we are the weekend of the symposium. So that is the Halifax Paranormal Symposium. I'm just trying to get a picture up. Bear with me. Here we go. So this is this coming weekend. This is on the 7th, and there's going to be all kinds of amazing speakers, some of which have been on the show several times. And let me get those up. Because that's a big one. Hold on. Oh boy, hard going solo. Miss you, Bubbles. Come back. Anyway. Okay, here we go. There we go. We've had Kim Moser on the show. We've had Daryl Walsh on the show twice in the last probably 2 or 3 months, along with director Elliot Van Dusen. We've had Chris Stiles on many times through the last 2 or 3 years. A lot of really great speakers. Richard Gallagher, of course, Lauren Coleman. So guys, check them out. It's one day only, and it is this coming Saturday. So don't miss out. Also, oh, look at that. It's totally left me. Sorry, guys. Hopefully they'll come back to me at before the end of the show. So tonight, we welcome for the very first time, and I mean, you guys are going to love this, Mark Dawidziak. I really hope I said that properly. Anyway, he's going to be discussing his book, A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Mark has got like an exceptional background. I mean, exceptional. Just to knock off a few key points, he was trained for his Mark Twain performances by Hal Holbrook. Yes, he does Mark Twain performances. Great friend of Ray Bradbury's. He was also good friends with Richard Matheson, who contributed to many of the stories on the Twilight Zone. And this guy just has literally everything going on. I mean, I'm looking at his website. Holy crud. Okay, let me just pull up the website and go through a few things over here. He's an actor and a playwright. He has consulted on many, many different scripts and books, and He is the author or editor of 25 books, including 3 studies of landmark television series The Columbo Phile, a casebook, The Night Stalker, companion, and everything you need to know and learn about the Twilight Zone. He does all kinds of lectures. In fact, right now, I think he actually talks about the Columbo Phile, the Shawshank Redemption, Theodore Roosevelt, Mark Twain, Edgar Allan Poe, of course, vampires, and oh my God, there's just so much with Mark that I don't think we're going to cover it all in one show. And I have no doubt that we're going to bring him back on again. So, without further ado, I'm just waiting for him to come on board and fill you all in because honestly, there's just way too much to this guy and he is exceptional. Just saying. So, hold on. Let me get some pictures too. We're going to do a show and tell, which is, well, kind of a show and tell. Edgar Allan Poe. And a lot of these photos that I'll be showing tonight, I think we've got 4 of them, are courtesy of the poemuseum.com. So I really want to make mention of that because, again, these guys are really informative. Anybody who loves Edgar Allan Poe should go to their website and check them out and show them some support. There we go. All right. I think I'm good. So hopefully Amelia is going to be back next week. Right? I know. There we go. We miss her. Very strange not having her across from me week after week, but hopefully that is going to change. So the chat rooms are all filling up. For anybody who wants to get into the chat room, I recommend YouTube, like, the Outer Realm YouTube, just because of the fact that we've got, more people coming in there. But there are 7 chat rooms. There is no chat room on Roku TV, and we are on Roku TV. Go and check out, the Outer Realm on Facebook. Check out the Outer Realm on YouTube, of course, United Public Radio Network, UFO Paranormal Radio Network. There's all kinds of places that you guys can get in on it. But please remember, guys, 7 chat rooms. Just kind of picture a, superhighway of multiple lanes coming down to like one. So we're going to try to get to people. And I know a lot of people just listen. We have a huge audio listenership. So we will try to make sure that everybody in Radio Land, because we are FM as well, kind of get the gist of what's going on, even though you can't really see everything. So, oh, hey, Z-Sun is in the chat. Mark Eddie, hello, hello. Ed, Odell, always nice to see you, my friend. Very nice to see you. So we're going to get started, guys. Let's get the show on the road and bring in our special guest. Hello.
Hi there.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing much better now.
Were you a little concerned about the?
I'm just a bit concerned, keeping me on edge.
I had it was not done on purpose, believe me.
No.
They kind of blew up on me,
Oh, that's all right. All that matters is that you were here, and I am grateful. And
I was always intending to be here at this moment.
A moment in time that was meant to be.
Absolutely.
That's good because there's a lot of people listening, so we're all excited. And honestly, I was perusing your website and I thought, oh my gosh, you just have so much fun stuff. Like, what an incredible career and job that you have.
Yeah, I like to say lucky. I've been very fortunate in a writing career to sort of pursue a lot of the passions, and when you do that, you tend to have fun. If you can combine those two things,
yeah,
the result usually is it's a pretty easy formula. The chemistry says you're going to have fun, so I do.
I mean, where do you start? I mean, I hate to say, you're very fortunate that you have a job, if you could call it a job that you really enjoy. Out of everything that you've done, is there anything specific that you enjoy the most?
I mean, I think writing the books is the most fun thing you can have, and that's always been the target. And that's my job now. My full-time job is writing books now.
Wow.
So I mean,
Very
that
nice.
was kind of where I wanted to be.
Right.
I kind of got forced into it because in 2020, journalism and I separated company after 43 years as a TV and film critic. And I was sort of forced into the lifestyle I wanted all my life. So,
right.
every time I've gotten blown up in my life, I've always been blown up to a higher place. I've always, it's always propelled me to a different thing. So fate knows better than you do,
Right.
and that's been true with every single book. I always this question comes up a lot. Is when I do interviews and somebody will say, "Well, what's your next book?"
Right.
And I like the question because it always assumes there will be a next book, and that's always a nice assumption for somebody to make. But
Right.
also, I always say, well, I could tell you what I think my next book is going to be, but it'll be wrong because I have been wrong every single. My first book was published in 1982,
Right.
and when everybody said at that point, "What's going to be your next book?" I was fairly confident and would say with full confidence, "This is going to be my next book." I was wrong then, and I've been wrong almost every single time. And fate this knows better than you do. I mean, you can think you're in charge, you're the captain of your ship, you're making the command decisions, but when you step back and look at the pattern of your life,
Hmm.
you kind of realize you were pushed into certain directions and that you were pushed to places where you were meant to be at a certain time in your life.
I agree with
And
you.
that's true with every single book I have written. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. Did you feel that you're just led? You're led to it, and characters take over, and that's it. It's like,
Somewhat, but I think also
mm,
it's you writing is a tough racket. There's a pearl of wisdom for you. Writing is an extraordinarily tough, as my old buddy Harlan Ellison used to say. Becoming a writer is easy. Staying a writer is hard. Staying a writer day in, day out, year after year, that's hard.
that's hard. Yes.
And
Yes.
so I've always kind of viewed it as my philosophy has been you expect 9 out of 10 things not to work out. You just have to be a short-term pessimist and understand you have to get used to rejection. If
Right. Right.
anybody in the arts, whether
Right.
you're an actor or an
Mhm.
artist or whatever,
Mhm.
you have to really toughen your hide to rejection.
Mhm.
And so the trick is to keep swinging. You're not swinging to hit 9 times out of 10. You're hitting for the 1 out of 10 that's going to come through.
Right.
And
Wow.
that's enough because I have a lot back in the day when I had an actual filing cabinet before
Right.
computers,
Right.
I have, a filing cabinet that's full of ideas for books that never got written and never got sold.
Wow.
And I think a lot of them are every bit as good as the ones that did. I think a lot of them are, just good, but their timing wasn't right, or
Mhm.
it wasn't what the publishers were looking for at that moment or that time.
Mhm.
So it's you if you keep swinging, you're going to hit it. You're gonna
Mhm. You're
you're
gonna
gonna
get
do it.
one, darn it.
But you
Right.
gotta keep. I mean, you don't hit it. If you stop swinging, you don't. It doesn't. Nothing happens. Nothing happens.
Right.
So
Right.
you know,
So, I mean, but it's not something you can go back to because, I mean, now you're more well known, the books all do well. So pretty you get to that point, I think, where you can put out anything and
I
it'll
think
at
it's
least get a
anything,
bit of
but it gets
attention.
easier
Well,
to get the editor's attention.
yes.
I mean, to this point, I mean, editors still. There are books I wrote early in my career
Right.
that were published by mainstream publishers that would never get published today.
Wow.
That I'm good. Like Mike, I mean, I'll give you a very good example. It's my
Yeah.
Columbo book, which was published in 1989 by Warner Books,
Mhm.
and the internet had its way with us in between when that book was published in 1989 and today.
Yes.
Now, the backbone of those books, those sort of deep dive looks at TV shows,
Mhm.
were the episode guides. Which would
Right.
have full cast lists and full credits and cast everything. And with that, with the best of those books came analysis and interviews and TV history and all that, and you got a whole lot came along for the ride. As soon as IMDb and Wikipedia came along, there was no need for those but nobody needs to have a shelf full of books to look up a credit. It's two
R
keystrokes
right.
on a computer, and you're going to look
Right.
at it. So mainstream publishers stopped doing those books.
Mhm.
I'm glad I did some of those books when I did because there is no market for them anymore. Well, I mean, I don't want to say no market, but it's probably going to be a small independent publisher, and it's
It's
going to be harder to make your living with a book like that.
right. And I find as well, you do have those of us who actually like to pick up a book and hold it and smell it and
Yeah.
turn the pages and just you know, and other people, everything's so digital, and I don't enjoy it as much.
I don't either, and like I said, I still think, the
Yeah.
book is the ultimate thing.
Yeah.
The book is a very durable, it's a survivor.
Yes.
People have been predicting that the book was gonna die for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Every time something new comes along, it's gonna be the end of the book, and people are gonna stop reading,
Right.
and it's never happened.
No.
It's never happened, you
No,
know?
and it will outlive technology, because one day, technology goes down, you get a blackout, you get supernova, whatever. The people are going to come to this planet one day and go, what are all these things that are left?
Yeah.
Books,
Mhm.
books. Seriously. You
So,
could, you,
yeah, if there's a way to make money by pushing nouns against verbs, I've probably done it, because I
right,
got a long newspaper career. I did
right.
magazines. I've written liner notes and such for DVDs and Blu-rays.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the VHS days for VHS boxes, I've done comic book scripts,
Mm-hmm.
plays,
Right.
novels, fiction, nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I've pretty much, done it, and I think that's kind of a model too that has. It's hard to be a specialist anymore. It's
Right.
hard, and unless you're Stephen King, it's hard to just say, "Well, I write one thing." And even Stephen King doesn't write one kind of thing.
Right.
But I think it's harder to sort of. I think you have to be more versatile, and I think you have to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's really kind of a 19th century model.
Right.
Sort of the idea of branding.
Mm-hmm.
And, where you say to somebody, "Well, I'm a writer," and they say, "Oh, what kind of writer are you?" "Oh, there are types? I have to choose these." "Oh, I didn't know that." "Oh,"
Yay.
I mean,
Right.
eventually we're probably the name Edgar Allan Poe is probably gonna enter into this conversation at some point.
Of course.
And if anybody knows anything about Edgar Allan Poe, if your first image of Edgar Allan Poe is probably the master of the macabre. It's probably our grandfather of goth. He is,
Yes.
our original purveyor of spooky stories.
Yes.
And the funny, if you had said that to Edgar Allan Poe, he wouldn't know what you were talking about.
Right.
Because Edgar Allan Poe, when Edgar Allan Poe died, he was only 40 years old in
Mm-hmm.
1849. They didn't get around to doing a really good collected edition of his work
Right.
until the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And by then, they had enough wherewithal to academically assemble all of his known writing.
Mm-hmm.
It was enough then to fill 17 volumes.
Wow. Really?
17, and that much of it is horror.
There we go.
Yep,
Mr. Poe.
that much of it is horror.
Right.
And yet it's what's defined him. It's what has because and he was and listen, I'm not taking anything away. He was good. He
Yeah.
was much better at it than anybody else who was doing it at the time. But if
Right.
you had said to him, "Oh, you're a horror writer," he wouldn't know what you were talking about. He said, "Oh, you mean goth? I write gothic stuff? Is that what you're trying to
Right.
say?"
Right.
Well, I guess I have some stories which are, good spookers. But look at everything else I write. I write criticism, journalism, essays.
Mm-hmm.
I write mystery stories. I write, he would have he would have just thought, well, that's just one arrow in my quiver. Well, if you look at all of the sort of the Mount Rushmore of writers who took the horror story into the modern age in the 1800s,
Mm-hmm.
that foursome would start with Mary Shelley,
Right. Yes.
who has a tremendous impact on both horror and science fiction and
Right.
predates Poe, So
Yes.
it starts
Yes.
with Mary Shelley,
Yes.
then Poe, then Robert Louis Stevenson with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the Body
Yes.
Snatcher, and then at the end of the century, Stoker with Dracula. Now that's kind of your Mount Rushmore
That's right.
of the writers, and not one of them would have considered themselves a horror writer,
Right.
even though they wrote all of the seminal horror stories.
I know,
of
but it was
that century.
brilliant stuff too.
Mhm.
You
But it's
know?
not until you get to the 20th century that we start branding people and, oh, you're a mystery writer, you're a romance
Yes.
writer, you're a horror writer, you're a Western writer, you're this, you're that.
Yes.
And, back then they didn't think they had to choose. They just said, well, Robert Louis Stevenson would have said, well, you know what? Yes, today I'm writing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but tomorrow I'm writing Treasure Island. And the next day I'm writing A Child's Garden of Verses. And the next day
Right.
I'm writing essays. He would
Yes.
have just been moving from one thing to another. And,
Yes.
there was something in him that responded to the horror story as there was to Poe.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't look at it as defining them in any way.
Right.
You know, and I think that model is going to be much more of a now modern model, because I think it's going to be difficult for somebody to say I only write one kind of thing. Well, good luck making a living then, because
That's true.
you have to be
Yeah.
willing to roll up your sleeves and try a lot of things.
Hmm.
You know, if you want to write horror, you're probably going to want to write a whole lot of other different things to support that habit.
Well, I mean, you look at Anne Rice, for example,
Mhm.
like known for all of her vampire stories, but she wrote erotica before
Well, she
that.
certainly did.
Right. Right. So
She certainly did. You know,
that's,
and there
yeah.
was a reason. I mean, and I actually interviewed Anne Rice a couple times,
Yeah.
and
Very nice.
I got her thoughts on Edgar Allan Poe, are in the Poe biography,
Hmm.
and she she was influenced by Poe greatly, which you can tell with her language. I think more than anything else, you could tell with her language and her specificity of uh, descriptive writing. It's
Right.
very Poe-like. And one reason was because her father, who didn't really have a lot of money, her father had one of the early, before anybody had tape recorders, her father bought one of like the early model tape recorders. And this is like, we're talking about the 1950s.
Right.
And this, the people who had them could record, oh yeah, radio shows, so you could listen to it later.
Yeah.
Well, her father recorded his own version of Poe stories for her, as a little
Oh,
girl.
wow.
She was learning
Wow.
Poe at her father's knee, and she was also learning Poe, almost it being imprinted on her DNA as a child.
Yes.
So there was
Yes.
always something, in Anne Rice, I think, that responded to
Well,
the
childhood
uneasy,
memory,
yeah,
comfort,
yeah.
programming, you know, whatever
You
the
know,
case may
on
be.
some level, everybody
Yeah.
who sort of writes horror, no matter how much they write it, whether they write it full time or whether they just write it occasionally,
Mhm.
the one thing they all have in common is that they respond to the creak of the uneasy coffin lid, or
Right.
the dungeon door. There's something in
Yes.
you that responds to that.
Yes.
And if you read it and you consume it and you do that, it's something we share. You know,
Right.
there's something in you that, and you don't resist the call. If
Right.
you hear the call of the creaking dungeon door, you go towards it.
That's true.
And so that, and it doesn't mean it's the only thing you respond to, but it's there in you, and it cannot be denied, and it should not be denied.
No, I agree. It's one thing, there's always something that is embedded within us, and, I'd be all over the creaking creaking coffin door
Well,
forever, yeah.
this
I'm
is
funny
this
like
is where
that.
I became a horror fan at the age of 7.
Yeah,
1962.
right.
Um, 1960 to 63, I think. And it was a movie called Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein that did it.
Oh, I've seen it, I loved it.
Yeah, but I was there for the Abbott and Costello half. I was there for the comedy half, because that's up
Yeah,
to that age.
yes,
That's what I knew, and comedy was sort of king for me.
yes,
I didn't know what a Frankenstein was at 7,
right.
and by that time that movie was over.
Mhm,
It was mostly because of Lugosi's performance as Dracula in that movie, which
yeah,
he steals the movie. He's wonderful.
yes,
And by the time that movie was over, I had been transformed into a 7-year-old horror fan.
right.
And then I started to consume. Now, in the 60s, that's what we were. There's a bunch of us who sort of grew up in the 60s and
Mhm,
almost had this kind of shared childhood.
mhm,
And the reason it's a shared childhood is because there wasn't that much horror.
mhm.
It's not like today, where there's horror for everybody coming from any angle. You can choose. It's what do you
Yes.
want? How do you
You
want?
were lucky to have a Friday night. It would start at midnight, and you would have, like, 2 or 3 movies that would go till 4 or 5 in the morning, and they were the old black and whites.
Yeah, I mean, you had to scan your TV listings every week to see,
Yeah.
is there an old Universal horror film on? Is there a
Mhm.
Val Lewton movie on this week? Is there,
Yes.
the Invasion of the Body Snatch or something?
Oh, it's
You know,
crazy. I loved it. I
but
still love the old black and whites.
and we all got, Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine and Castle of Frankenstein, and we all got our Aurora Monster models, and we built our all
Oh,
13
anything
of my
Vincent
Aurora Monster
Price.
models are right
Yeah.
here on my shelves.
Yeah.
Today they call that child that they say you were a monster kid.
Mm.
That's the phrase for it now. And we didn't have that phrase in the 1960s. We're just horror fans.
Right.
That
But everything gets labeled in this day and age, I find. There's a label for
Americans love
everything.
labels.
Yes.
We love it.
Yes, yes. You're not wrong.
We are all like scientists who want to stick pins in insects and label them and put little numbers on them
It's
and say,
true. Labels and buzzwords.
and we love our, that's one thing that the 20th century did. We love our specialists.
Yes.
We started to penalize versatility and celebrate
Mhm.
our specialists.
Yes.
So, like, Alfred Hitchcock did thrillers.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
he was but Robert Wise, as a director, people don't think of Robert Wise as the same class as Hitchcock. And if you put all of Robert Wise's credits together,
Mhm.
he's taller than almost anybody. He
Right.
did great horror movies like The Body Snatcher
Yeah.
and The Haunting. He did
Yes.
great science fiction like The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Oh, I know. It's
He did
excellent.
he did boxing movies. He did film noir. He did musicals like West Side Story and The Sound of Music.
Yeah.
And it's almost like people became suspicious of versatility. Like, well, if
Mhm.
he has to bounce around like that, is he any
Why do you
good?
think that is?
One of the things was because there were critical schools that came in the mid 20th century and on into the 60s.
Mhm.
It sort of celebrated the auteur theory and the
Yeah.
idea of, people who specialized, like artists specialized, like,
Mhm.
of this school.
Mhm.
And, so versatility in writing and directing, and sometimes even in acting,
Mhm.
was not looked on as was almost looked on with suspicion, which
Hmm.
is odd, which is
Right.
very, very
Yeah.
odd, you know. And
Yes.
and writers are built differently. You know,
Mhm.
there are some writers who are natural specialists and are happy at being specialists, and God bless them. That's what they should do.
Mhm.
There's nothing wrong with that, as they used to say on Seinfeld. There's just nothing wrong with that.
Mhm.
But you know, other writers feel the need to try different things. And
Mhm.
you said, you opened by saying, I looked at the things you've written. Well, if you've looked at the things you've written, one of the conclusions you must have come to is that this is one of the most deeply schizophrenic resumes I've ever seen in my life.
I loved it.
This guy bounces around like nobody's business.
It's true, but it's great. It's great. Being
I think it is.
versatile. Yeah, it
I
is.
think it is.
It is because you could just immerse yourself in different things. Like I have interest in so much of everything that is on your website. I go back to Mark Twain for just a minute. I remember being in Jamestown where he stayed. He spent a year at a home there that I was brought to visit of a friend of his, and it was this. Now it's this crazy haunted house, but I love it because the history behind it, the fact that he came up to Jamestown, and it's where he wrote Mark Twain.
So
Or
and
Huckleberry Finn.
he spent his
Huckleberry
summers
Finn.
he spent all his summers in Elmira, which is close to Jamestown.
See there you go.
He spent his summers at Quarry Farm, which was his sister-in-law's farm,
Yeah.
and he did the majority of his writing in upstate New York. So yeah,
I
there's a
love
huge
it.
tie between, and he used to pack up his family, and he lived in Hartford at the time, and he would pack up his family every summer and spend the entire summer in upstate New York.
Mhm.
And Rod Serling did the exact same thing.
Right.
They're
Really?
separated by 90 years. They were born 90 years apart.
Mhm.
And Rod Serling every summer would pack up his family and he would head to Ithaca, New York, which, if you're looking at like Jamestown, Ithaca,
Yeah.
Elmira, that is
Yeah.
really close.
I
That's
know, it's like a
really
triangle
tight
of just
group. Yeah,
creativity.
yeah.
No,
So,
I love it. I love it.
mhm,
So getting on to, the man of the evening, which of course is Edgar Allan Poe, and this biography that you wrote right
mhm,
here. I
mhm,
had to shrink it because unfortunately, the computer likes to do weird things and I
mhm.
couldn't get the whole book in. So here we are.
There you are.
What what prompted you to want to write the biography for Edgar Allan Poe? Because it is mysterious. Like as soon as you mentioned when he died, we already had Chris Phoenix in chat room going, "What? I just learned something new. What do you mean he died this young?" There you go. Hang in there, Chris. It's gonna be one heck of a night.
Well, I'll start with the notion that I have a very healthy ego. There's nothing wrong with my with my sense of artistic ego.
Right.
But I do not have the hubris, let's say,
Okay.
to have positioned myself as being the next person to write a biography of Edgar Allan Poe.
Right.
I don't have that in my. And if I'm associated with any 19th century American author, it's clearly Mark Twain.
Right.
Not only are 5 of my books about Mark Twain, but I've been playing Mark Twain on stage for 45 years.
I love it.
So, and when I started, I was 22 years old, and it took me 2 hours to look like this.
Wow.
So, I mean, the makeup process got shorter every year.
Yes.
So, I was, I've given papers at Twain conferences since
Mhm.
for 25 years. I've
Wow.
published a lot on, different anthologies about Twain.
Mhm.
And 5 of the books are Twain centric.
Mhm.
So, I sort of built up my credentials in
Right.
studying Twain.
Yes.
And but I had done a book for St. Martin's called "Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone," and it was
I
sort of
love
my
it.
lighthearted
One of my
tribute
favorite movies. Yeah.
to Rod
A
Serling and the
series.
Twilight
Yeah.
Zone.
Yeah.
And the book had done well enough for us to talk about the next book, because when you sign a contract with a major publisher,
Yeah.
there is what's called an option clause, and the option clause means that you have to offer your next book to that publisher. They
Right.
don't have to publish it,
Right.
but you have to at least offer it to them. The idea being, if they had a hand in your success with one book, you at least owe them the chance to do your next one. And
Right.
that's a sort of a fair clause to be in
Right.
there. And the Twilight Zone book had done well enough for us to have that discussion. So in the fall of 2019, I was having a discussion with an editor at St. Martin's about what the next book would be for them. And again, once again, as I say, you're not in charge. This is one again, where fate's going to step in.
Right.
He said, "Well, what are you thinking about?" So I hit him with what I thought was my 100% surefire, can't miss idea, and it missed badly. He was not the least bit interested in my can't miss idea,
Wow.
and I said, so he countered. He sort of said, "Okay, what about this?" And I didn't like his idea, what he thought I should be doing. So I
Right.
countered with my next best idea. He didn't like that. And we kind of went back and forth. And we were just getting to the point where we were going to table the conversation for another day. Weren't getting anywhere. We were just spinning our wheels. And it was a very pleasant conversation. This was not an unpleasant. This was just process we were
Mhm.
talking. And we were just about to get off the phone. And he said, "What about Edgar Allan Poe?"
Hmm.
And I said, "What about him?" And he said, "Well, I don't. There hasn't been a major biography of Poe in quite a while." And I said, "I don't think that's right." And then I looked back. I said, "Actually, the last major biographies of Poe were in the 90s. So it has been a while. It didn't seem like it'd been that long ago."
Mm.
And then I said, "Well, Poe is a writer I've carried through my entire life. Not long after I became a horror fan at the age of 7, I discovered there was this writer named Poe who had a hand in." Creating the modern horror story, and I became intrigued. Now, most people first get Edgar Allan Poe in the ninth grade or the seventh grade. Most people, Poe enters into the curriculum with the Telltale Heart
Yes.
around the 7th grade. So I discovered Poe actually a little bit before that, because if there used to be a thing, there might still be, called Scholastic Books,
Yes.
and they would
Yes.
bring the catalog around to your classroom
That's right.
every so often, and then you
Yeah.
could order books from the catalog.
That's
Well,
right.
after one of the books that were in the catalog was this book. It's a
And Crowd.
10 Great Mysteries by Edgar Allan Poe. This is the very book. I ordered this from Scholastic Books,
Wow.
and this was kind of the start. This was kind of the start of what turned into an immense Poe library.
Hmm.
So I've carried Poe through my entire life. In my 20s, set out to read everything that he'd written. In my 30s, I set out to read everything that had been written about him, all of the biographies and the scholarly
Wow.
works. In my 40s, my wife and I, we have a theater company, a touring theater company, and we started performing poems and stories by Poe. So Poe is a writer I've carried through my entire life, but despite that, I would have never said I'm the candidate to write the next biography of him.
Right.
So I said to this editor, "Why did you say Edgar Allan Poe?"
Mm.
And he said, "Well, it seems to me he checks a lot of your boxes." Again, sometimes it takes somebody else to point out the obvious.
Yeah, from the outside looking in.
And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, Poe was a major 19th century American author. You've written about a major 19th century author with Mark Twain.
Mm-hmm.
Poe was a critic most of his professional life. You were a critic most of your professional life.
Mm-hmm.
Poe was the father of the modern mystery story. You've written a book about a classic mystery character with your Columbo book.
Mm-hmm.
Poe was the father of the modern horror story. You've written about horror topics like Dracula and the Night Stalker.
Yeah.
How does this not check all your boxes? And
Right.
I thought, yeah,
The light goes off. You're right.
I guess that's right. But then it became
Yes.
sort of like, well, what kind of biography were you thinking of? And this was where it was over before it started. Because it became very quickly obvious that the kind of biography he wanted was the kind of book that seems to get published every 2 years. It seems to arrive on the noon stage with regularity, and it's the book that purports to definitively solve the identity of Jack the Ripper. We're finally going to do this. Now, we must be up to about 15 or 16 definitive cases that have solved the Jack the Ripper murders.
Right.
And everybody, and there'll be a new one, and just hold on and just wait where you are. Sooner in a year or so, there'll be another one that'll say it has definitively solved the Jack the Ripper murders. And I said he wanted that kind of book about how Edgar Allan Poe died, something that would definitively solve the mystery of Poe's death.
Right.
And I said, let me tell you why that book can't be written. A, there was no autopsy. And even if there had been an autopsy, this was 1849. The autopsy did not enter the modern era until the Civil War. The Civil War was a defining moment in the development of autopsies because we got very good at cutting up bodies during the Civil War.
Right.
So even if there had been an autopsy on Poe, they wouldn't have known how to do it, and it would probably have been conducted with the equivalent of butcher's knives. So it would be worthless to us today.
Right.
There wasn't one anyway.
Right.
There's no death certificate.
Wow.
There is no surviving soft tissue that can be subjected to modern forensics. There are no reliable witnesses to Poe's death. All of the primary witnesses to Poe's death contradict each other and pretty much contradict themselves. They leave behind accounts which contradict their previous accounts. So all of the witnesses are untrustworthy, to put it mildly, including the attending physician, John Moran, who left behind 3 accounts of Poe's death, all of them wildly different in details and tone. Moran goes so far as to change the time of death and to change Poe's last words.
Were there last words? Or like how, what, so what is the, okay, so let's back up then. So this is, I guess, the mystery. The biggest mystery is how he died, obviously. So what is the speculation and what?
Well, let me put it this way. There are about 25 theories as to how Poe died.
God.
And this is why I told this editor, if this is the type of book you want, you'd better go find yourself another lunatic because this one's driving away.
Right.
I said, but I'll tell you the book I will write for you. I'll write a book that examines Poe's life through the filter of the mystery of his death, which is one of the most enduring things about Poe. And it's one of the reasons the subtitle is reversed. If you look at the subtitle, it's A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe.
That's right.
Now, one reason is because a lot of discussion of Poe starts with the mystery of his death, and with good reason. It seems to be the starting point. Now, with most biographies, start at the logical point where you usually start, which is when somebody is born. But with Poe, it always seems we start with his death at the age of 40 in 1849. And this enduring mystery, well, it encompasses one of the great literary stage exits of all time. Poe dies in a manner that reflects his two greatest literary achievements. Poe dies under circumstances which are horrific, because he dies, he's lingering, he's in great pain. He lingers for many days at a hospital in Baltimore. He is sometimes out of his head. He's sometimes raving. So this is a condition which would not be out of place in one of Poe's own horror stories. And then Poe dies, and he leaves us, the father of the modern detective story, leaves us with a mystery. In fact, he leaves us with a double-barreled mystery, which is not just how he died, but before Poe is discovered on the streets of Baltimore on October 3rd, he goes missing for 6 days. He gets on a steamer in Richmond heading for Baltimore. By the moment his foot is on the deck of that steamer, a curtain comes down on Poe's life. And he goes missing for 6 days. And we have no idea where he was during those 6 days. A lot of theories about this too. But not one witness came forward after Poe's death to say so much as I passed him on the street during those 6 days. I had a conversation with him at the railing of the steamer on our way to Baltimore. Nothing. So
it's like he just didn't exist.
It's an amazing stage exit. It's amazing that somebody dies. I mean, there are 3 great stage exits in literary history. The first is Moliere, because Moliere was a playwright and an actor. And he was dying of consumption. You know, what we know today is tuberculosis, what they called consumption back then.
Yes.
He's dying of consumption, and they are premiering his last play, and he's in it. So he's dying, and he's trying to get through the performance. He collapses on stage. They drag him into the wings, and they revive him. He goes back on stage, and he finishes the production.
Oh, my gosh.
Then he goes home, and he dies. Now, that's pretty good.
That's amazing.
A pretty good stage exit, folks. You know?
Wow.
And there's Twain. Because Mark Twain is born in November of 1835 with Halley's Comet visible in the night sky.
Wow.
Halley's Comet returns in 1910. And the year before, Twain correctly predicts that he will die when the comet comes back. He tells an audience that the Almighty has said, no doubt, that here are these 2 indefinable freaks, the comet and me.
Wow.
We came in together. We must go out together. And he pulled it off. He dies in April of 1910 with Halley's Comet in the sky. So he comes in with the comet, and he goes out with the comet. And folks, that's a little item which would not be out of place in Greek myth. A hero coming in with a comet and going out with a comet. That's so that's pretty good. But in some way,
amazing.
Poe beats them all, because Poe actually dies under circumstances that reflect his literary achievements. And that, I mean, as one Poe scholar said to me, it's almost as if a press agent approached him at some point and said, you know, Eddie, the best thing for you is to die at 40 under circumstances which are right out of your own writing. You know, it can't be better than that. So in some ways, Poe beats them all. And so this kind of ongoing mystery of his death, and the fact that in some ways it's an unsolvable mystery, because I told him, if I come up with a theory as to how Poe died, and I believe it is convincing, logical, compelling, I will present it. But I am not going to go so far as to say that I can prove it.
Right.
Now, did I come up with that kind of a theory? Yes. Can I prove it? Do I insist on it? No. No,
Right.
I think that would be irresponsible.
Right.
And I'm not even sure it's a mystery I want to see solved.
Right.
Because we would lose something if we solved the mystery of Poe's death. We would lose a very romantic aspect of what we know of Edgar Allan Poe if all
Right.
of a sudden this was solved.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's an old saying that some mysteries are not meant to be solved.
Right.
I'm not so sure that this isn't one of them.
Wow. That's interesting. But I mean, it's almost like the legends, all the legends that we read about, and part of the allure of that, because I mean, realistically, Poe is a literary legend.
He is, and
So
as a matter of fact, most of his reputation is built on misinformation.
right. Right.
Another reason I wanted to write the book was I wanted to reclaim Poe as a writer and
Mhm.
as a person. I wanted to, we have built of Poe a sort of funhouse mirror reflection of who he really was.
Mhm.
It is a picture that's etched in distortion, and it's based on myth and misinformation.
Mm.
And the real Poe was probably nothing like you think he was.
I feel he sort of had a bit of a sad life,
Well, it's
really.
a very sad life, yes, because he was battling poverty the whole time, and also because he was a genius and he was about the only one who knew it, which
Right.
is going to condemn you to a fairly lonely life in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. But Poe had a lot of friends.
Mhm.
And I mean, one of the reasons I set out to write the book was the stereotype of who Poe was did not match up with the person who must have written those stories.
Mhm.
Now, this all happens. This all starts. You see, one of the few things we know for certain about Poe's death is that he stopped drawing breath on Sunday, October 7th, 1849.
Mhm.
It's a fact. And then
Yeah.
we know that he was buried the next day in a small Presbyterian cemetery in Baltimore
Mhm.
on a very rainy, cold, dreary day at a service attended by very few people.
Hmm.
And then we know that the next day, October 9th, he was buried again, because the next day, an obituary appears in a New York newspaper written by somebody who Poe thought was a friend, but was actually somebody who had been harboring resentments against him and grudges for years. And he waited
Wow.
until Poe died, and before the body was even cold, he launched his attack. And the man's name, get ready to hiss, because this is one of the great villains of Poe's life, and he's got a name that sounds like he should be a villain. His name was Rufus Griswold.
Ah,
Now, doesn't that
yes.
sound like it's right out of a Victorian
Yes.
melodrama?
Yes.
Ah,
Yes.
Rufus Griswold
Can you
coming
hear
for
me
clothes on
hissing?
the widow.
I
Yeah.
hiss very well.
Well, Rufus
Mm.
Griswold writes an obituary that begins, I'm paraphrasing, but he writes, the day before yesterday, Edgar Allan Poe died in Baltimore. Some will be surprised, few will be grieved. And then it went downhill from there. And he accused Poe of every immoral act, and just painted him as a liar and a cheat and a terrible person and a drunkard. And the damage that Griswold did has not been undone today. It exists yet today.
Wow.
And he was not done. He spent many years flailing obsessively at the corpse of Edgar Allan Poe. He writes more pieces and he adds more accusations and charges to Poe,
Mhm.
against Poe. He does everything he can to destroy Poe's reputation.
And why? Why?
Well, he was bearing grudges against Poe. Poe thought so much of Griswold, he named Griswold his literary executor. He put his literary
Oh,
reputation
boy.
into the hands of somebody who was his bitterest enemy, and he didn't know it.
Oh my gosh.
So,
Oh.
so Poe's reputation just now, is there a counterattack? Yes, there is. Some of the counterattack comes from Poe's friends, and yes, Poe had a lot of friends. He was not
Mm.
friendless, but it then comes from the French, led by Baudelaire,
Mm.
who idolized Poe. and Baudelaire goes after Griswold, hammer and tong. He calls Griswold a pedagogic vampire.
Right.
He famously asked the question, because of Griswold's treatment of the deceased Poe, are there not ordinances in the United States that prevent dogs from running loose in your cemeteries? So he compares Griswold with a dog. He
Wow.
really goes after him. But the French basically replace one stereotype, the immoral drunkard, with another one, which was that Poe was touched with insanity, and these stories somehow came from a mind which was a little unhinged. Well, that was a very romantic notion of the French. They liked the idea, and all of Poe's characters and stories are reflections of who he was. Poe is the narrator in The Telltale Heart. Poe is the guy talking to the raven. Poe is Montresor in The Cask of Amontillado, leading Fortunato to his death. They're all Poe. These are all, well, that's nonsense. These stories were not great because Poe was insane. They were great because he was a great writer in total control of his craft. He was a great artist. And if you chalk it up to insanity, you're undercutting his genius, as his true genius as a writer. But from this, a stereotype emerges. And, you know, it's nice in some ways. I mean, fame has been a double-edged sword for Mr. Poe. On the one hand, those small little group of stories, the horror and mystery stories, have kept him alive. But they've also defined him. That we basically look at Poe and we think horror and mystery. And if you think of, well, you know, Poe, and you say, well, Edgar Allan Poe, everybody's got an image already.
Yes.
Well, that's pretty good, actually. Can you start? I mean, if I say, you know, Herman Melville, does anybody have an image of Herman Melville? What he looked like? What he, you know? Could you even pick Herman Melville out of a police lineup? You know, but Poe. We put Poe on T-shirts. We make action figures of him. We put him on tea tins, and we put him on plushies. You can go into
He's a household name.
Yes. You know. You go to a Barnes and Noble store, and there's shelves and shelves of Poe. You know, where are the shelves for Emerson? Where's the shelves for Hawthorne? You know, But we market Poe. But we market an image of Poe, which is, again, it's a stereotype. And the stereotype is probably this. See if this sounds familiar. You know, Edgar Allan Poe, a sickly guy with a sallow complexion, deep sunken eyes, a haunted look, probably sitting up in an attic somewhere, surrounded by cobwebs, a raven perched on his shoulder, and a black cat, red-eyed, prowling through the dust and the cobwebs while Poe spins out his tales of horror and terror in fever dreams fueled by alcohol and possibly drugs. And that probably sounds familiar because that's probably an image most people have of Poe. Well, here's the secret. None of it's true. Not a bit of that is true. Poe was nothing like that. He was athletic. He was healthy for most of his life. It's not till the last couple of years that he really starts to look sickly. He doesn't even wear a mustache for the last 2 years of his life. So if you had passed Poe on the streets of Philadelphia in 1843, you would have seen a man moving at a brisk pace with a military gait. He'd been in the military. He was a good soldier. He was promoted as high as you could be as a soldier to a sergeant. And he never lost that kind of military gait. He walked everywhere. He could win any jumping or leaping contest because he was so athletic. He was a good boxer. He was funny. He was witty. He wrote as much humor as he did horror. We just don't read it. Yeah.
This is not a vision of Poe that we're
it's
accustomed to seeing, young Poe.
Yeah, and remember, he only lives to be 40, and all of our images of Poe, all of the established images of Poe come from about 7 or 8 photographs, what were called daguerreotypes, and a few oil paintings, a few portraits. That's it. We've got maybe 10 or 11 images of Poe from his entire life. And most of them are from the last 2 years of his life. And they're all from the last 6 years of his life. So we don't
Yeah.
even know what he looked like for the majority of his life. This is the one you're showing is from 1847.
Wow.
This is the beginning of the end. He still looks pretty healthy here, and this is the only picture that has even the hint of a smile. He almost has this kind of
Yeah.
little suggestion of a smile. This is sometimes called the David Niven picture because he looks a little dapper.
Right.
But this photograph, you look all the photographs that follow this, you can see Poe. This is a sick man. He's getting sicker and sicker as the years go on.
Right.
So all of our pictures, most of the images that we know of Poe come from those last 2 years when he was a very sick man.
Right.
And most of them are the daguerreotypes. And daguerreotype, nobody smiled in daguerreotypes.
That's true.
You see, this is a daguerreotype, what you're showing now.
Mm-hmm.
And this was taken a bit after the previous. Look how the difference in him.
Yes.
This is some guy, something's going wrong with Edgar Allan Poe. His health
Right.
is going off the tracks.
Right.
So he's starting to look a little puffy. He's starting to, so he is, but this is the image of Poe we have.
Yes.
But it's based on, and the other thing about daguerreotypes is they were done in studios.
Mm-hmm.
You sat in chairs in a studio, in very uncomfortable chairs, and the chairs had braces. And that was to keep you still because the lens had to stay open for a long time. There was even a brace that held your neck in place.
Right.
And you were told not to smile. Everybody looks constipated in daguerreotypes, the statesmen, presidents, everybody.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is because we were told don't smile because it's hard to hold a smile for any length of time.
Right.
So everybody was told look serious. So Poe looks serious in the pictures, and people think, oh, that's who he was.
Right.
But if we had one picture of Poe laughing, if Poe had lived into the era of what was called the Kodak, the candid photograph, where anybody could take pictures of their neighbors and such, and we had pictures of Poe playing leaping contests in his front yard and splitting his pants and laughing himself silly in the process, how would that change our image of Edgar Allan Poe?
Right.
So Poe is just not who we think he is, and we've built this kind of stereotype. And then the 20th century, the pop culture takes over, and we take all of that, confusing him with his unreliable narrators, the French wanting him to be, a little bit crazy, the damage done by Griswold, and we mold this kind of sickly master of the macabre image that this grotesque caricature that we make of Poe. And the real Poe was nothing like that, and the real writer was nothing like that. He was a very serious writer.
Right.
Somebody, if you know something about Poe, some people will say, well, he was an alcoholic. He had a problem with the bottle. Yeah, well, yeah, he did. Alcohol was a problem, but it probably wasn't the problem you think it was.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the record's fairly clear. From the moment that Poe kind of takes his first real drink as an adult, as a student at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, all the way to the end of his life, all the witnesses to his drinking say the same thing. It took very little alcohol to get Poe roaring drunk.
Mm-hmm.
Poe was never one to savor a drink. He would throw it back in a gulp.
Right.
And then it would be like he'd been drinking for hours. It had an immediate and terrible effect on him.
Right. Right.
And then it took a long time for him to get over it. It wasn't just a simple morning hangover for Mr. Poe. It took days to get over the drinking, which means alcohol had a devastating effect on his system. And it also means he probably was allergic to alcohol. Now, he wasn't drinking all the time. There are these long documented periods of sobriety where 12, 14 months, he wasn't touching it. He wasn't going anywhere near it. And during those times, he's a very careful, exacting writer. He's revising his stuff constantly. He's writing all sorts of stuff, not just horror. Poe's problem is he takes the exact wrong moment to take a drink.
Right.
Or to pick a fight.
Yeah.
Always his own worst enemy throughout his life. To the point where sometimes you want to reach into the pages of a biography and slap him and say, wait, really? You think this was the moment to pick a fight? Really? This guy's trying to help you.
Right.
Same thing. So
Yeah.
the episodes of drinking got blown all out of proportion. And people sort of thought he was drinking all the time. Well, listen, you cannot live to be just 40 and leave behind enough writing to fill 17 volumes, especially to the high level of writing that Poe did.
Yeah.
And be drinking all the time.
Right.
Impossible. So
Right.
were there these long moments of, yeah, most of his life, he's not drinking,
Mhm.
but alcohol is a continuing problem throughout his life.
Right. Right.
So yes, I mean, alcohol is always there, and it's always kind of a contributing factor. You
Mhm.
know, if say like, well, do you think that's what killed him? I'd say no. I don't think alcohol killed him, but I think alcohol was an accomplice. I think alcohol undermined his health. I think it was a contributing factor. I think it had such a devastating effect on his system. It weakened his system, and it certainly set him up for, other causes.
Mhm.
So I think, if it's not our primary suspect, it's not our primary person of interest among all the possible causes, but
Mhm.
it's in the room as an accomplice,
Right.
So I do think I don't dismiss alcohol as a
Mhm.
problem in Poe's life, but I do try to put it into some kind of proper proportion to Poe. So
Right.
that's what I say. The part of the whole aim of the book was to sort of shatter the myth, shatter the caricature, and replace it with the image of the real writer, the real person who wrote that. You know that in his lifetime, Edgar Allan Poe was not best known as the author of stories of horror and mystery?
It would be hard to imagine him well known for anything else.
No. And he wasn't best known as a poet. He was best known in his lifetime as a critic, as a literary critic, as America's leading literary critic.
Really?
He wrote a vast amount of literary criticism for various magazines. And he was so feared and he was so tough as a critic, his nickname was the Tomahawk Man. And
Never knew that.
he had a lot of enemies.
Wow.
But in his lifetime, Poe was known first as a critic, second as a poet, third as the author of stories of horror and mystery. Our century has reversed that order. We know him first as the author of horror and mystery,
Mhm.
secondarily as a poet, and third, if you know it at all, as a critic. And that's only three of the major accomplishments of Poe's life. He
So
was a
there would be a lot of people out there who would want to see him dead.
I don't know if dead, but he made a lot of enemies.
Ill will to a bad critic who can do damage to a career.
He was dismissed mostly by the elite because Poe understood. He was a very good critic, but we know it today.
Mm,
Today we realize just how good a critic he was because the people he championed were really good. He championed people like Hawthorne and Washington Irving and people who really deserved to be remembered. And the people he went after deserved to be forgotten and dismissed.
right.
And, one of the reasons I also reversed the death and life of Edgar Allan, one of the reasons I reversed it was because in his lifetime, Poe got very little money.
Mm,
He battled poverty. He'd write, there were no copyright laws, so he would write something like The Raven. He'd get paid 45, $50 for it.
and be
And then
done.
it would be reprinted in every newspaper and magazine up and down the coast. And he would not get another dime for it.
Mm,
So, Poe understood he was a genius and he understood that he was ahead of his time.
mhm.
And, I said to one Poe scholar while I was writing the book, you almost wish you could go back and tell him and say,
Yes.
you're going to be the one they remember.
Mhm.
They're not going to remember. They're not going to put Emerson on T-shirts. They're
That's
not going to
true.
make action figures of Thoreau or Longfellow.
Right.
You're the one they're going to remember. You're going to become the best read American writer, not just in your country,
Mhm.
but around the world. And it's not going to even be close. And when I said that, the Poe scholar looked at me and said, I think he knew. I think he knew. And then I said, you
Interesting.
know what? I think you're right. I think he did know. I think he knew time was on his side. And that's
And
one of the things that you go back to the idea that he gets buried, in Baltimore, he gets buried by Griswold. And then, in 1875, he got buried again because they dug him up. They dug up
why? Why? Why did they dig him up?
was where they put him originally in a small cemetery in Baltimore. They wanted to put up a big monument. By 1875, there was kind of starting to get this idea in Baltimore that maybe this Poe guy was worth paying some attention to.
Mhm.
They wanted to put up a nice monument to Poe. but there wasn't room for that monument in the little part of the cemetery where he was. They wanted
Right.
in a different part, so they had to dig him up. So they dug him up and they buried him again, you know. And then Poe gets buried again in the 20th century under sort of all of the marketing and grotesque Edgar Allan Poe, our master of the macabre,
Oh my
and all the
God,
pop
the poor
culture
man.
has its way with him. But here's the wonderful thing. If you know anything about Edgar Allan Poe stories, here's the one catch-all rule. Nothing ever stays buried in an Edgar Allan Poe short story. And,
I completely am with you on that.
and Poe is not going to stay buried either.
No.
He is going to emerge triumphant from the grave and have the best afterlife of any American writer. He is
Right.
going to outlast, outshine, outperform all of those writers who are supposed to outlast him.
Right.
Poe is gonna have the last laugh when it's
Right.
all over. And that's the main reason I reversed the subtitle. And it's the death and life of Edgar Allan Poe, because he's gonna overcome the death. He is gonna however he died, he's
Right.
gonna overcome it, and he's the most alive American writer today.
Right. Right. Despite everything.
Despite everything.
And despite all the efforts.
And it's wonderful. I mean, you think about it. Everybody, you know, one of the things that's been Poe's good friend in all this, not only the pop culture has done its share to keep him alive, you know, starting in the 1930s with the Universal films with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, like The Black King, The Raven, and in the 60s, the Vincent Price films for Roger Corman. But right up to date, no American author has the street cred that Poe has. He's on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. He's not only on the cover, he's got the top central position. He is name-checked in songs by John Lennon and Bob Dylan. He is been shown up as a character in episodes of The Simpsons and South Park. He has been parodied and redone all across the spectrum. He's mentioned in the Wednesday series, it seems every episode he is in some way mentioned and referenced. It's not, nobody's got the street cred that Poe's got. And so this is the most amazing afterlife of any American writer. And
yeah, because you know what? He's a poor guy, has just had the worst breaks. Like he had a childhood love, you know, or a youthful love. And he got derailed from Amira, right? And ended up, I think, before death, reconnecting with her.
Yeah, he was good. They had an understanding. Mara Royster and was his childhood sweetheart. And when he went away to the University of Virginia, they considered themselves engaged. He promised to write. Her father was dead set against the match.
Yeah.
So he intercepted her letters.
The
letters that he sent to her. She thought he'd forgotten about her and broke his promise. And then, with her father's urging, married another man. Poe goes back, find she is betrothed to another man. You know, and she thinks he didn't write. He was writing regularly, and the father was intercepting and destroying the letters. So he, you know, this is one of the. But this is a guy who loved women in his life all the way through. This is right from the start, because his mother dies, who's a great actress, Eliza Poe. She dies before he's 3 years old, and he's at the deathbed, and he's taken in by the Allens, which is where the Allen part of the Edgar Allan Poe comes from, Richmond. He's never adopted, so he's always made to feel like not truly accepted. But he does love his foster mother. She dies. He sort of idolizes the mother of one of his best friends, and she seems to be somebody who really understands him. She dies, you know, and then his own wife Virginia dies of tuberculosis in early at the age of 20, at the same age that his mother died, in her early 20s. So he loses women. You know, you see in Poe the theme of idealized young women dying young. Those are in a lot of his stories and a lot of his poems.
Yeah, it said that he was very much at peace in his life with his sisters.
He's very much at peace with when this is kind of like there's no way to make this sound good today, because you say this out, you might as well say it out loud, but it's going to sound icky.
Right. I like that. We'll go with icky.
Poe marries his first cousin, who's 13 years old.
Right.
And that's Virginia.
Right.
Now, number one, child brides were not out of the ordinary back then.
No. Right.
And marrying your first cousin was not that.
No.
Even among wealthy Virginia aristocracy, that was not that.
Well, it's yeah, exactly.
Today, you say it out loud and people think, but he did marry. But by all accounts, it's a very happy household.
Yes.
And because with Virginia comes Virginia's mother, in other words, Poe's aunt, who now becomes his mother-in-law. Right. She adores Poe. She approves the match. She adores them. Right. And the three of them are a very happy household. It is here that Poe finally finds this sense of being truly accepted and loved.
Right.
And when Virginia dies, very young, that really begins the spiral. That really begins the death spiral for Poe. He's sort of out of control for the last couple of years of his life.
Mm.
And he's really casting about. He courts several women in the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. And you can see he's kind of desperately trying to replace Virginia in some way. Mm-hmm. And have that household back that supports him. He needs that. He needs that emotional base, because he loses people so constantly throughout his life. So yeah. Right. So it is a very sad life in a lot of ways. Yes. And it is marked by loss. Right. No question about that.
Well, right to the end, his own loss, before he has a chance at happiness.
That's right. So, I mean, at the last year, it looks like a lot of things are starting to fall into place the last year. He's returned to poetry. There's this kind of triumphant return to poetry at the end, and he writes some of his greatest poems in that last phase, The Bells and Annabel Lee.
Yes.
Those are all written in the last phase of his career.
Yes.
He looks like he's got an understanding, and he's going to marry Elmira. It looks like he's going to get the dream of his life of being able to edit his own magazine, which is one of his great dreams. And He looks like he's got the backing of that. So there's a lot of reason for optimism right now. And just at that moment where it looks like things are starting to fall into place, that's when the rug gets pulled out from under him. And, and he's gone. He's gone in a matter of days.
Yes. Which is interesting. So I think a lot of it ties into, where did he disappear for 6 days and comes back, and they see him and he's sort of, a little bit on the delirious side and sort of raging a little bit, and obviously in a lot of pain. Do you think, I think poison. I always go to the whole, okay, maybe he just kind of got into something he shouldn't have. Wrong people.
The one of the main theories to explain the missing days is that Poe got cooped, and cooping was Baltimore was a rough town.
Right.
Even by 19th century Eastern Seaboard standards, it was a pretty rough town. Any port city would have had a rough section.
Of course.
Would have had a harbor section. Would have had a very tough section.
Sure.
So, but Baltimore, even by those days, had a magnificently bad reputation. Baltimore's nickname back then was Mob Town.
Jeez.
Because they would riot at the drop of a hat.
Right.
And they took their rioting very seriously. When they rioted, they would, they would drive the mayor and the sheriff out of town, and they would have to bring in the militia and the army to restore order. It would take days.
Wow.
They would burn down the houses of leading citizens. They rioted regularly in Baltimore. So Poe leaves Richmond. He heads for Baltimore. If he was sick when he got to Baltimore, and an election was going on in Baltimore at the time, and the rival political parties used to do this thing called cooping. And what they would do is they would kidnap people off the streets, and then they would make them vote in different wards, be repeat voters in different wards. And
Mhm.
in between, they would keep them captive in pens, or coops, like chicken, what they call like a chicken coop or a pen,
Mhm.
and so it became known as cooping.
Hmm.
So one of the theories is that Poe ends up in Baltimore, and he gets cooped. And one of the things they would do they would change your clothes, so to keep you from being recognized as you went from polling place to polling place.
Right.
And he was found in clothes that were not his own, ill-fitting clothes that were not his own.
Okay, so that might make sense.
It's a very Baltimore explanation, and it's a very good explanation to sort of suggest at least part of the missing time
Mhm.
of where he was. And if he was a sick man at this point, and he was kept in, a cold, barren place, it
It
would
would
have
have
been
got worse.
seriously undermining his health.
Right.
It would have been seriously, a case of undermining his health. But there is a murder theory. There is a
Mhm.
theory that the Roysters did not approve of Poe as a match, and
Mhm.
that her brothers followed him and beat him to an inch of his life, and that this led to his death. I don't buy that one for a second. There's no
Mm.
proof. There's no evidence of that.
Right.
And Poe's body was examined when he was taken to the hospital. If he had been beaten, there would have been obvious physical,
Bruises and such, yes.
and there was none. So
Right.
I
But I mean, to be cooped, would there be evidence? I mean, you go there to disappear, right? And
no,
go,
well, no evidence has ever, nobody that
right,
like if he had been cooped with somebody who came forward and
right.
said, "Yeah, I was cooped with him. I was kept in a." No, no, no. There was no.
Nothing like that.
It's a
Hmm.
theory. It's a theory,
Right.
and we have no evidence that supports it, other than the fact that there was an election going on the day Poe was discovered insensible on the streets of Baltimore.
Hmm.
It fits. It,
Right.
but it does. But it fits, and there's no proof. So, you know.
Right.
And
Right.
the other problem with how Poe died is, as a forensic pathologist told me, who examined the case for me, Poe died under what is called non-specific symptoms. Now, non-specific symptoms are symptoms that can be caused by any number of possible causes.
Hmm.
Poe was delirious. He was feverish. His nervous system was shot. He was out of his skull some part of the time. Now, that
Hmm.
can be caused by a lot of different things.
Hmm.
It can be caused by encephalitis. It can be caused by what they call brain fever back then, or
Hmm.
what we now know to be inflammation of the membrane. It can be caused by rabies. It can be caused by all sorts of things.
Right.
Those are very common causes, symptoms. So you can bend a theory around the symptoms. You can bend your theory. You can say, "Well, I think it was a brain tumor." Okay, that works.
Right.
"Well, I think it was rabies." Okay, that works.
Right.
I discount a lot of the established theories because uh, of probability and evidence.
Mm.
Like rabies became a very popular theory, but
Mm.
the record's pretty clear that Poe took liquids. He was in the hospital in Baltimore for a few days, and it's pretty clear he took liquids. And if you can swallow liquids, it ain't rabies, because you
Right.
become hydrophobic if you have rabies. And
Hmm.
the very idea of swallowing water will make you foam at the mouth.
Right.
So I don't think it was rabies. If he took one sip of water, it wasn't rabies, and I think he did.
Right.
So I discount murder. I discount
Right.
rabies.
Right.
Um, for a
Right.
while, one theory was illuminating gas, because the gas that they used in the lamps of the time was giving off fumes, and that the illuminating gas that he was always writing, he was always hunched over. But what
Hmm.
that doesn't take it, that sort of plays to the stereotype of Poe, that he's always
Mm.
at the desk. Poe got out a lot. He walked everywhere. He was not wealthy enough to own a horse or carriage, so he
Mm.
walked everywhere. He got a lot of exercise most of his
Hmm.
life, and he wasn't cooped up most of his life. And guess what? One of the few things we can test is hair. And we do have samples of Poe's hair. There was a custom when somebody died that you would take
Yes.
snips of hair. So we have a lot of actual snips of Poe's hair, and some of that has been tested. And what it has shown is that his levels of illuminating gas are way below lethal levels, way below. anything that could have caused him. So we sort of say, well, we don't think it was illuminating gas.
Right.
So
Did you find anything in the samples that could give you a hint aside from what it's not?
no, as a matter of fact, a lot of what we discovered from the hair is actually good. We found out that his diet was good, that he actually had a very good diet, a lot of fresh seafood, a lot of vegetables, a lot of, he actually seemed to have had a very good diet.
Right.
And that's something the myth of Poe is that, the family lived on bread and molasses for months at a time. And that seems to have been nonsense.
Right.
So we actually found out good things about his levels of things that would have killed him. There's nothing in the hair samples that show anything that would have been a good cause of death.
Right. So what dare I ask, or do you just want to save it for go out and buy the book?
I don't want to ruin the book for anybody who is, I do have a theory, and I do think it's a good one.
Okay.
And I do think that it's I treated all of the various causes like I was a detective on the case, and all of the possible causes were suspects.
Okay.
So what I kept saying was, if this were a murder investigation, which suspect would you keep having back in the room? Which is the one we'd keep drawing back into the room? Which one has the most means and opportunity?
Right.
Which one is our primary person of interest here?
Right.
And then who are our main accomplices? That's kind of where the book leads. The book leads to that theory.
Right.
And again, I don't want to, because
no, of course not.
At the end, it's the
defeats the purpose. It's the
so
bang.
I don't want to say what it is. It is kind of out there, but I for a lot of people want to read the book. It is kind of getting to the end.
Right. Right.
So, but again, I don't insist, because I basically say I think this is the best theory as to how he died.
Right.
But I can't prove it. I'd love to be able to say I can prove this, but I can't. And I don't. Again, and I take that back. I don't want to say I would love to be able to prove it, because I don't think I would love to be able to prove it. I think I want this to remain a mystery.
You want it to stay a mystery.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I do. I think it's one of the. It is one of the enduring things that keep him alive. Ironically, his death is one of the things that perpetuates his memory in his life.
Right.
And so,
well, we love our legends.
Very well.
We love our mysteries. We love our legends. And I agree with you. I think if you solve the riddle, you solve the mystery, then all of a sudden, he just sort of slips away.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it's just one more death. It's just one more. Oh, okay. So I like the idea that this is, the title, A Mystery of Mysteries, comes from one of his poems, Spirits of the Dead. Right. It's not one of his well-known poems, but I love it. And, my wife and I perform it. Sarah is a wonderful actress.
Very nice.
And we perform. It's the last thing we do in every Poe show we do. And it's become one of her favorite poems. She always says, you can have this read at my funeral. I love this poem so much.
Beautiful.
But the last stanza of the poem is, the breeze, the breath of God is still, and the mist upon the hill, shadowy yet unbroken, is a symbol and a token, how it hangs upon the trees, a mystery of mysteries. And that's where the title comes from. So it is a mystery of mysteries.
Right.
And, but but again, I'm much more interested in rescuing Poe as a writer. See, this is very much this is not an academic's book.
Yes.
This is not a kind of a scholarly book. This is a popular biography. It is meant to be read, and it is meant to be enjoyed. And it is a writer's biography of a writer.
Right.
And I can't pretend to be a kind of writer I'm not. I can't sort of pretend to be an academic. The big definitive academic biography of Edgar Allan Poe. There are better people for that.
Right.
And they're working on it. People are working on that kind of a book right now. And it's going to be an important contribution to Poe studies when that gets published. This book is very much meant to be a popular biography. And my style of writing is, it's very conversational. you know, and it's very accessible. I
Mm.
try to, you know, Mark Twain once said that the books of the great geniuses are wine, and in comparison, mine are only water, but everybody drinks water.
Mm.
And I think that that's kind of my approach too. And I took a chance with this book. I took 2 chances with this book.
Mm.
Um,
Yes.
one was that I have a dual timeline. You know,
Mm.
the book goes between 2 different chapters. One chapter will take you through the last few months of his life,
Mm-hmm.
and then they alternate with chapters looking back at the bigger sections of his life until the 2 timelines meet at the
Mm.
end, and you get my theory as to how he died.
Right.
So I came up with a technique which was different than the average biography, which basically goes A to Z, birth to death.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Poe was not he didn't play it safe. So, you know, I don't think a biography of him should not play it safe.
Right.
And the other thing I did was I did interviews. And he's like, well, how do you do interviews for somebody who died in 1849? There's nobody alive who knew Edgar Allan Poe. There's
Mm-hmm.
nobody alive who knew anybody who knew Edgar Allan Poe.
Mm-hmm.
So I did interviews with all the leading Poe scholars and biographers. I interviewed forensic pathologists and forensic anthropologists,
Mm-hmm.
medical historians, um,
Good
specialists.
reason. It lends, it lends to your theories of credibility. I think it
It's
was a
also
good
the
way to
way.
go.
Again, I can't pretend to be another writer. I was a journalist for
Yeah.
43 years, and that's
Yeah.
how a journalist operates. Like a journalist or a documentarian does interviews.
Yes.
You know, and to me as a detective on the case, these were my witnesses. These were the
Mm.
people I went to and said, what do you think? And not the least of which of the people I went to were horror writers, and horror directors, people like
Mm.
Stephen King and Anne Rice,
Mm-hmm.
and actors like Vincent Price,
Yes.
and directors like Wes Craven,
Yes.
who understood what it takes to do this and do this at a high level.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the things that led me to sort of believe that Poe wasn't the person we made of him.
Right.
And that is that one thing I found in common with all these people, Stephen King, Anne Rice, Ray Bradbury, Wes Craven,
Mm.
all of them had great senses of humor. They were very funny people.
Mm-hmm.
And when I remarked to Stephen King about this, he said, well, of course, you know, if you did not have a sense of humor and you did this, you'd go crazy. You
I can
need a
see
sense
that.
of humor to ground you if you're going to explore territory this dark.
Yes. I could see that completely.
And humor and horror are twins. They are flip sides of the same coin. You know, they're the 2 metaphoric devices we use to approach things we don't like to think about. We don't like to talk. They allow us to address really difficult subjects.
Mm-hmm.
And they're easily dismissed by critics, too. They're 2 of the hardest forms to write and to be true masters of.
Mm-hmm.
But I noticed that all these people had great senses of humor. And Stephen King, he said, you know, horror writing's cathartic. We put it down on paper, and then we give it to you. It's your problem now. We're done with it. You know?
Right.
And then I thought, no, wait a minute. If Poe was so good at this, then doesn't it sort of logically follow that he had a sense of humor? And it turns out he did. He was very funny, very witty, and he wrote a lot of satire, hoaxes, humorous pieces. We just don't read those pieces today.
Right.
But even some of the horror stories are richly funny. Cask of
Right.
Amontillado has some dynamite laugh lines in it. And
Right.
It's a terrible story. It's a grisly story.
Right.
But it's also very funny.
Right.
So one of the things you literally learn is that you don't think of Edgar Allan Poe as a comedy writer.
No.
But he was. He actually did write as much humor as he did horror. So, and he did have a sense of humor. So the one thing we deny him is the one thing he must have had.
Right.
He had to have had a sense of humor to have done this well.
Mm-hmm.
He did.
Right.
So
Right.
that's one of the things I wanted to do. So I took two chances with this, you know, which is basically, as a writer, that's kind of like going off the high diving board, just hoping there's
It's
water.
a chance. It's
Yeah,
a chance.
hoping there's water when you get down there.
Yeah.
So if anybody doesn't like this book because of, you know, the structure, I can't blame them. Yeah, okay, it's not your book because I did write it this way, and I made every intention of writing it this way.
Right.
But I can't pretend to be a different kind of writer.
No, no. Well, I mean, I think I like your approach. I
Well,
like
thank you.
yeah,
I hope
you're
so.
welcome. I think we concentrate so much on the macabre side of everything that we sometimes forget that these were real people. They had, real lives. They had ups, they had downs, sad stories, happy stories, diversity. And I think when people delve into it, because we love our mysteries, our legends, and we love, the whole age that surrounded him, like you say, Bram Stoker was a big one. Mary Shelley. I mean, we don't look at the fact that these people wrote many other things. I mean, I know Dacre Stoker, and we've talked a few times, and he's just like he wrote so much other stuff.
Yeah.
And he goes, and the one thing that he's remembered for is, of course, Dracula. And you look at Poe, it's the same idea. It's the Raven, it's Annabelle Lee. It's like there's so many, which leads me to this question. You're saying like there's no descendants. Is there like who got all the literary stuff? I know you got paid for it and went out to all of these different. I think I read that the Raven got what, $15, and then just
Something like that. Yeah, I have to look at. I have to read my own book to remember how much.
Yeah, no, but how? Where did it all end up?
It all ended up, in the public domain. It all ended up, which is where it is today. All the writing ended up in archives. Finally, people started collecting it. So the original manuscripts ended up in archives across the country, places like the University of Virginia or the Poe Museum in Richmond or Brown University. But I think you hit on something there when you were talking about the this kind of obsession with the macabre aspect of somebody's career. I think that's one of the things with Poe that has perpetuated it. I think people don't really want to hear that he wasn't that guy. And I think it's because they're afraid we're going to lose the fun Poe.
Right.
And it's sort of like, well, what I'm trying to say is, Poe didn't write those stories because he was obsessively that macabre guy.
Right.
He wrote those. One of the reasons he was so good in writing those stories was because he was interested in everything. All of that fed this genius with the horror stories. It wasn't because that's the only thing he was interested in, and that's the only thing he wrote. But I do think that people are a little afraid of losing the fun Poe, and I'm as guilty of it as anybody. Look,
the guy's an icon.
Yeah, do I have a Poe action figure on my head? Yes, I do.
I love
do
it.
I have Poe T-shirts and Poe coffee mugs? Yes, I do. And my wife and I, every time we do when Sarah and I do our show, we always tell people Edgar Allan Poe did enough to fill 17 volumes. He was this, he was that, he was this, but tonight we're doing the Raven. We're just like everybody else.
Right.
But I think the example of this is if you look at in like 1960, the beginning of that remarkable decade, when everything, the whole world got turned inside out and upside down, and everybody questioned their place, and we came out of the conformity of the 50s, and everybody sort of was busting loose, and it was a time of liberation movements and people sort of being able to be their own person and be their own thing. It's an amazing decade. It really is.
Right.
And if you look at the beginning of that decade, the two best-known American writers are clearly Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes.
They're the two instantly recognized. And again, like I said before, writers aren't recognized in this. But if you showed people a picture of Mark Twain or Edgar Allan Poe, they
know who they are just by looking at them.
Right.
Yes.
And, both of their reputations in 1960 were based on stereotype. For Twain, it was sort of the grandfatherly man of letters, the boys author, the author of children's classics, the witty guy, the observer of American, the American scene, sort of a genial grandfatherly image.
Yes.
It was an image jealously guarded by his one surviving daughter, Clara, who suppressed a lot of his writings because she was sure, just certain, that they would destroy his reputation if they ever
Wow.
found out.
Wow.
So Clara dies, in the early 60s, and the suppressed writings start to come out.
Mm-hmm.
And they do the exact opposite of what Clara feared. They enlarged our view of Mark Twain. And all of a sudden, we understood that Mark Twain was a very serious social critic.
Right.
He had a lot to tell us about politics and religion and what he called the damned human race.
Ooh.
And Twain gets bigger and bigger, but we don't lose the fun Twain because of that.
Right.
Now Poe comes out of the 60s, the same guy that he went into the 60s. He's we still love him as the master of horror and mystery.
Mm.
And we still love him at the end of the 60s, so the same thing, but we haven't changed our perception of him that much. And it's kind of still true today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the reasons is people are a little afraid of losing the fun Poe. And it's like, well, you can't lose him. He was just so darn good at that stuff.
Right.
We're not going to lose that Poe by just acknowledging he was a much bigger, greater artist than just those few stories we know him for.
Right.
So, and by acknowledging that bigger, greater writer, you'll better understand the person who wrote those stories and why he was so good at writing those.
Mm-hmm.
Vincent Price once said that the person who limits his interests limits their lives.
That's true.
Very good. Now, he wasn't talking about Edgar Allan Poe, but he might as well have been, because Poe was a guy who was interested in everything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this guy was interested in rocks and ancient languages and geography and expeditions. And
I could totally relate to him.
He wrote one
for those reasons.
He wrote one piece that people think foreshadows modern physics. He's that's how much his brain worked, in all of these different ways.
Yes.
So he is, one FBI agent that I interviewed for the book thinks Poe not only created the modern mystery story, he was in some ways the father of modern forensics, because he creates the idea of profiling.
Right.
If you look in his book of how you figure out something, and that's an amazing thing to say, that this guy did. So Poe,
he was a pioneer in many ways.
But all of this feeds his skill as a horror writer.
Yes.
It doesn't detract from it.
Mm-hmm.
It shows you why he was so good at it.
Yes.
And that's why, that's another reason I wrote the book.
Well, I also think that there were a lot of, and I just see Cece's comment here that I'll put up. Hello. In Lovecraft's essays, poems, and letters, Poe is mentioned multiple times. Lovecraft wrote, "When I wrote stories, Edgar Allan Poe is my model, but Poe was my god of fiction." So I'm sure he paved the way, or was an inspiration for many writers.
Yeah. And Lovecraft, credits Poe with being, bringing the horror story into the modern age.
Yes.
Lovecraft says, Poe brought it.
Yeah, I love Lovecraft too. Yes.
And I agree with that. Now, one of Lovecraft's pen pals as a young man was Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho.
Right.
And Bloch, he's was a great horror writer. Bloch, everybody knows him just as Psycho, but Bloch was just an amazing writer.
Yes.
And I interviewed Robert Bloch as well about Edgar Allan Poe.
Right.
And so here's a guy who knew Lovecraft, or was at least pen pals with Lovecraft.
The liaison.
Yeah. And so it goes back to Poe, and Bloch idolized Poe too. Ray Bradbury also had a lot of great things to say about Poe as a horror writer. And Bradbury said Edgar Allan Poe took the horror story and he made literature out of it. It's not far wrong. Now, Mary Shelley was there first, and she gets a lot of the credit.
I know she should get a lot of credit.
Yeah, but Bradbury's not far wrong.
Yes,
in sort of saying that.
Yes.
And the odd thing is that Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, said pretty much the same thing about Poe as a mystery writer. Right. Arthur Conan Doyle arrives in America for a tour in the 1890s. So, you're talking, 40 years after Poe's death.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And but he's acclaimed as the creator of Sherlock Holmes. And he has a press conference, and there are a bunch of American reporters in the room, and they think they're going to get him. They think they're gonna, so one of the reporters says, isn't it true that your Sherlock Holmes is just a ripoff of Edgar Allan Poe's C. Auguste Dupin, his detective who appears in The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter?
Yes.
And Doyle shocks them all by saying, yeah, yes. Basically, he said, we all got it from Poe. Everybody who writes about this kind of erudite super sleuth who can enter a room and see what nobody else sees, that is Poe, Poe's invention. And yes, they're all living off of Poe. On the 100th anniversary of Poe's birth in 1909, Doyle addresses an English gathering of mystery writers, and he delivers a tribute to Poe, and he says, where was the mystery story before Edgar Allan Poe breathed life into it? So what Conan Doyle is saying about Poe and mystery, Bradbury and Lovecraft are saying pretty much the same thing about horror.
Right.
That he's breathing life into these two forms.
Yes.
And the mystery writers got there first because the Mystery Writers of America's annual award is the Edgar Award.
Right.
Probably not to denigrate anybody. The horror writers, when they started there, they called it the Stoker Award, but I think that's because Poe was already taken.
I think so.
No, because I love Bram Stoker, but I do.
I know. I know. I sort of love the whole, like I did. I love Mary Shelley. I love Bram Stoker. I loved Edgar Allan Poe. I love Lovecraft. But but I go back to I don't know. I always say I'm an old soul, but I loved some of my fondest memories were staying up on a Friday night at midnight once a month, waiting for the whole night to be just the old black and white movies. This was in the 70s, and my father would say, "Okay, I'll stay up with you," figuring I needed to have my dad with me when I'm watching these horror movies. Meanwhile, dad falls asleep and I'm still like wide-eyed and just like this. I love it. And I still enjoy them.
It's a wonderful age. I mean, it's one of the great things, about Poe too, is that Poe has kind of become our one and only renewable literary resource.
Right.
Because almost every other writer has dropped out of curriculum. And the public schools and even the private school levels, they don't teach. Even Mark Twain, they don't teach much anymore. He's dropped out.
That's sad.
Well, it is very sad, but Poe at least stays there. And the first time almost everybody gets Poe is the 7th grade, and that's a great age to get Poe for the first time. Because let's face it, 7th grade for most kids, reading is a bloody chore. Who likes to read in the 7th grade? Now, there's always the one or two kids. You may have been that one kid who loved to read in the 7th grade.
Oh, yeah. I used to read like a I don't know, book every couple of days.
But you were the exception.
I was a weirdo.
Yeah,
I was reading.
Right. You were surrounded by a whole class of people like you,
Yeah.
So the 7th grade, I mean, oh, no, not another reading assignment. No. And then all of a sudden, 7th grade English class, they give you the Telltale Heart. And they give you Edgar Allan Poe. And all of a sudden, reading has come from being a bloody chore to being a bloody joy.
Oh, yes.
And you get Edgar Allan Poe. And what is Poe doing? Poe is dismembering corpses. He's putting people in torture chambers.
All the little weird grade 7ers going, yeah.
Walling them up alive in catacombs. And the great thing, the amazing thing about all this is that nobody lifts an eyebrow. Nobody complains about this. Can you imagine giving students these very same stories written by contemporary authors? You would have an outcry, from one end of the country to the other. You're giving them what? Yes. And yet nobody complains about Poe. And I think one of the reasons is that all of the parents and the grandparents got Poe at the same age.
Right. And
they love and approve of Poe.
Right.
So they don't raise an objection when their 7th grader gets Poe. It's like when my father was in high school during the Depression, during the 1930s. He got Poe. He loved Poe. You know, he could
Right.
remember all the stories. And that's the thing. After every Poe talk I give, somebody comes up to me afterwards and says, I still remember reading The Telltale Heart for the first time. I still remember, The Black Cat, or I had to recite to memorize the first 4 stanzas of The Raven, and then they do it for you, and I never
Yeah.
stopped because it's very important to them.
Yes.
And you realize, what other author can you do this with? What other author, not only could you recognize what he looked like, recognize his picture, but then also know and have a connection to some of his writing, whether it's The Raven or The Telltale Heart or whatever it is. That is real recognition. That is, for a writer, that is supreme recognition.
Isn't it normal, though, upon death, how many writers become more famous just because of what
But
they're
then they tend
writing?
to slip out. I mean, they do.
They
So
miss
some
it,
writers do, but then they sort of,
Yeah.
after a while,
They
there's not
phase
that many.
out.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
not like the schools are even teaching Hemingway and Faulkner at this point.
Right.
But Poe's still there, and Poe's not only there in the 7th grade. You keep getting him. You get him in the 8th, 9th, all the way
Yes.
through high school. And then if you take literature in college, you're going to get him again.
Yes.
So, you got Poe in school. I got Poe in school. All God's villains got Poe.
That's true.
And
I know.
that's the amazing thing is like, so Poe gets, curriculum and the pop culture. And that's a very formidable 1-2 punch. That is an amazing one that keeps him going and keeps him
And you
alive.
really get those who, like the first editions.
I was in
Just saying.
Just today, I was in a hospital in Akron, Ohio.
Yes.
Not for me, but
Yes.
but I was in the emergency room. I was walking through the emergency room, and a doctor, about 50 years old, I would say, comes up to me. Now I have this kind of a vest that I wear. It's sort of a sportsman's vest, but I love it because it's got pockets. I'm not a sportsman.
Yeah.
Don't fish, don't hunt. But I love pockets. All writers love to have pockets. A place
Right.
to put, pens and keys and notebooks and things. And people have given me pins with writers on them. Pictures of writers. So I have a Mary Shelley and a Bram
Love
Stoker,
it.
and and Anton Chekhov, and all these Robert Louis Stevenson. It's got to be 13, 14 pins. So the doctor looks at me. I'm obviously trying to get somewhere. He's talking. He says, "What's with all the pens?" And I said, "Well, I'm a writer. They're writers." And then he won't let me go. I mean, I think we're in an emergency room. Don't you have somewhere to be? But he looks them all over and he says, "Well, I recognize Edgar Allan Poe. It's the only one he got." Now he did. I said, "Well, how about him?" Mark Twain, and so he did get Twain. I gave him points for that.
But again, the two most known for 2 totally different ends of the spectrum. I think it's
Black and
really
white. We always pictured Mark Twain in a white suit. We always pictured Edgar Allan Poe in a black suit.
Exactly. Exactly. Both ends of the spectrum, but both like literary giants.
There was a writer named V.S. Pritchett who famously said that all of American literature comes from those 2 19th century scarecrows, Edgar Allan Poe and Mark Twain. And that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but
wow.
But it's not far wrong either. There is an argument to be made that between the 2 of them, they really are the 1-2 punch of American literature in the 19th century.
Right.
19th century.
Well, I mean, you have so many countries have their authors, and we have, Poe and Twain, and I think it's great. We need somebody too, darn it. And darn, we pack a punch when you think about it.
Well, in some ways, as a literary critic, and this is sometimes where Poe gets overlooked. Poe is kind of out there as a literary critic calling for an American voice. So he understands that, in the 1830s, American literature is sort of under the thumb of English literature.
Yes.
And Poe understood that, American literature would never really grow up until we escape the thrall of Europe in general and England in particular.
Right.
Poe believed we should not bow down on a knee to English literature. And we should create, he's in some ways like our John the Baptist out there,
Right.
the critic. He's calling for, and Twain's going to be the one who answers the call. Twain's going to be the one who provides the first truly American voice
Mm-hmm.
and writes in the vernacular. Actually has a teenage boy be the
Mm-hmm.
narrator of a book speaking in vernacular.
Right.
So in some ways, Twain's the guy who is the fulfillment of what Poe is calling for.
Right.
So it's easy sort of dismiss Poe as a critic today because
Mm-hmm.
nobody reads the criticism, but he's a really important American critic.
Right. Right. I think he's important on a whole lot of levels, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot of people tonight. Maybe, like I always say, 'tis the season, but it's always Poe season.
It is. Oh, that's exactly right. There's never a wrong season for Poe. That's
Exactly.
exactly right.
Exactly. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to go and revisit that. And for those, I mean, who haven't, shame on you. Not really, but yes. So he'll get out there and start with, I'm going to put this up right now once again, and maybe you could tell us where to find your book.
Well, it's certainly available on Amazon, but it's also available in bookstores, any Barnes and Noble or BAM. Any quality bookstore near you should have it or be able to order it for you. So
Right.
this is from St. Martin's Press. So and they did a wonderful job. I love the cover.
Beautiful cover.
One of
I
my
love it.
favorite covers of any of my books.
Yes.
And they actually designed 3 covers for this book. They sent me
Hmm.
3 covers and said, "Which one do you like?" And I said, "Well, there's only one choice. This is it." And
Right.
an editor who looked at it said, "It breaks every design rule in the book, and it works.
Right.
Perfect. It's absolutely perfect." And I said, "Yeah, and Poe broke all the rules."
Right.
So
Right. I love it.
so I do like that, and I break rules in how I went about writing the book. So I thought it was the one who fit the book the best too, because
Yeah,
I
it's a
love
great cover.
yeah
I love it. It's just, especially with the raven, and there he is in silhouette. I just love it.
yeah, and the thing I want to say like how we love the fun Poe, Poe
Hmm.
loved the fun Poe.
Right.
When the Raven hits in 1845. Poe finally gets this kind of this taste of celebrity that had been denied to him for so long.
Right.
And he actually now becomes known as the Raven Man, and he loves
Right.
reciting it. He was a very good reader. He was very dramatic. He got his mother's acting ability, and so
Hmm.
if he was going to read it, in a salon, he'd go and he'd make sure all the the lightings were just perfect and just right place. And he had this beautiful Tidewater, Virginia accent, and
Hmm.
so he was in great demand to read The Raven, and
Right.
he loved it, and he loved the he had this fame, and he sort of courted. His hero was Lord Byron, so he loved
Hmm.
to dress in black, and he'll have this kind of cut this
The
romantic
persona.
figure, and
Yes.
after The Raven hit, he'd go out and walk the streets of New York, and the neighborhood kids would follow him and throw pebbles at his heels. The Raven Man,
Wow.
and shout, at him, and he'd wait, and just until they got close enough, and then he'd wheel around and he'd say, "Nevermore!" And they'd all go running. They just loved it. He loved it. They loved it. So he played up to it,
Right.
when he was
Right.
living in his last home, which was a cottage in the Bronx, and the Bronx back then was farmland. It was just all most of it was unsettled.
Right.
It was really the Hicks.
Right.
Well, he had a little cottage there where he lived with his wife and mother-in-law. And one day, a friend came calling with his teenage daughter who wanted
Hmm.
to meet Poe.
Right.
So when they got to the cottage, they were invited inside, and the girl was sort of looking around, and Poe knew what she was looking for. Poe knew exactly, and there was he said, "No, there's no raven here. I don't keep a raven." And she's looking. There's a picture of a woman on the sitting room of the parlor of the cottage, and he says, "That's not the lost Lenore," you know. So he
Right.
knows what his image is. He
Yes.
knows, and he doesn't mind having fun with it himself.
Right. Right.
You know.
Hey, gotta roll with it. That's the way it goes.
Yep.
But we're already up at the top of the hour. My gosh, it just flew by. Just amazing. I have to thank you so much for joining me this evening. I love Edgar Allan Poe, of
Yep.
course. So this for me was a real treat, and I could listen to you talk for hours about it. I really could. So thank you. And God, I wish you well on whatever you decide to write next. Sure, it's going to be
It'll be
amazing.
something. It'll be something. And
It'll be
we're
some.
talking about like 2 or 3 different things right now.
I know,
We've
and
got
you
like
know what?
3 finalists that we're kinda trying to think of what we're gonna pitch, and I keep saying, "It's not gonna be any one of the 3. You watch.
You
You watch.
watch.
It'll be
No,
something that comes out of left field."
you're going to be led where you have to. But I will contact you because I think I'm perusing the website and I would love to have you back on again to
Sure.
talk about something else. I think it would be great. So
I've done an entire book on Dracula, so, that's
I'm down.
Stoker
I'm down. I
is
actually own a first
is a
edition.
favorite
One of my
topic.
favorites, the first book I ever read.
Yes. It's a heck of a book. I
It
mean,
is.
the difference between Bram Stoker and Edgar Allan Poe is that, Poe's kind of whole body of work is very
Yes.
Stoker writes one book that's bigger than himself. He writes
Right.
one book where he
Yes.
really catches fire. And I
Yes.
do like some of his short stories and even some of the other novels like Lair of the White Worm and,
Mhm.
yeah, I do like some of his other, but they don't come close to Dracula.
No.
But hardly
No.
anything does. And he just catches fire with this one
Yes.
book. And
Yes.
it is an amazing book.
Yes, it
Nobody has
absolutely is.
ever come up with anything as metaphorically perfect as Dracula.
I know. It is. Everything about it to me was just ideal. And of course, having visited the homeland, so to speak. You definitely it's a work of fiction, but it's really interesting when you start seeing some of the locations and you realize he never stepped foot there.
Well, and that amazing decision to write an
Hmm.
epistle approach to the
Hmm.
novel and
Yes,
have this it reads like a record. Almost all horror and fantasy ideas sound silly when you say them out loud.
that's true.
When you just explain them to somebody. It's
Right.
always in the execution. You say like, "Well, we're gonna do this movie, and we're gonna have a bunch of people stranded on an island, and we figured out how to clone dinosaurs. That's what we're
I
going to
know.
do."
Yeah,
It's silly. I mean, it really sounds
I
like, "No,
know.
it's Jurassic Park. It's gonna be great."
I
You know,
know. I know.
it's any idea when you kind of boil it down to the basics, kind of sounds. But the really good ones, like Jurassic Park,
Hmm.
make it feel like it's something that actually not only could happen but is happening.
Right.
And Dracula, you read Dracula, and it reads like a record. It reads like, he's got this like almost verite style that
Oh,
he
I
does with
know.
Dracula. And it's one of the great things because he's presenting an absurd story in its
Hmm.
basics. And yet you read this thing and it just like, this feels like it's actually
Just
happening.
like butter.
Yeah.
And we will do that for another night.
Great book.
So thank you so much.
Yeah. Well,
I
thank
will
you.
be in touch.
Thanks,
Thank
Michelle. I really did enjoy it. And as you can see, I just need to overcome my shyness and come out
I
of my
love
shell a
that.
little bit.
I hope you had a great time. I had a blast.
I did. Thank you. Well, that's good because this is your show, and that's what's important. It doesn't matter what.
It's your show too.
Well, I'm going to have a good time wherever I go, so it doesn't matter what I think. Like I say, I always ask the host if it works for you, it works for me.
It worked.
Good.
Thank you, Mark.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Well, we have come to the end of another fantastic segment of the Outer Realm. Big thank you to Mark Dawidziak. I really hope I didn't butcher that again. God, I'm terrible. Anyway, huge thank you to Folgers Coffee. Huge thank you to Justin Snicker, Dr. Snick, the Sonic Surgeon, Steve McGinnis. All photos tonight came courtesy of the PoeMuseum.com. So go check it out if you want to see more. And we've been putting Mark's stuff across the board, so check him out. Next week, guys, we welcome back Rebecca Pittman, who's going to be discussing the Lizzie Borden house and the famous Leap Mansion in Ireland, keeping up with Spooky Month. Thursday night, we welcome back Deborah, God, I got to say that right. Thunderbeat is going to be discussing ancient Egypt in Sedona. You heard it right. There will be photos. So definitely join us. And for everybody in Canada, happy Thanksgiving this weekend. See you next week. Good night.